this way. I always try and open with something to get your attention. If you've been to my house, one of the things you know that Christy and I take some joy in is plants. It started when Christy first came to the U.S. I thought, okay, she's coming from a tropical environment, and she's about to discover the dark, brown sadness of winter. So we decided to buy plants and kind of make a little mini jungle in the rental house we were in, sharing with the guys over on Liberty Street. And we made a pretty good jungle out of the dining room. And we killed some plants, we learned some things, we grew a lot of stuff. And then last year we moved to our own house, which has a yard. So our plant game got to expand. We had a lot of fun in the things we grew creatively around a house, but now we've been planting things in the yard, stewarding, more space. And so more space, more joy. And some of the things out there, yard growth is a different thing than plants in pots, which is sort of a short game. Now we have some long game things. So I decided I was going to change how the bushes in the front yard looked. Had my own plan for them, and that basically means last year I massacred the bushes. I trimmed them down to the point where there was bald spots everywhere. One of my neighbors came over and was like, "So you're going to rip those out and throw them away, right?" As far as he was concerned, by the time I finished, they were as good as dead. And I was just kind of smiling. I was like, no, they'll grow back in. And I know that I pushed them back and separated out how I want. And I'm not looking at the patchy bald mess of yesterday. I'm thinking of what I'm investing in and stewarding and how this will look in a couple of years. And by the end of this summer, it's already grown into where there's a few spots that still need to cover over, but they don't look dead. And they're shaping out into what I was going for. I knew if you give them some time, they'd come around. What I'm describing is gardening joy. We don't have to do this. None of this was mandatory. We're having fun. We're enjoying hacking plants and watering them and transplanting them. And I'm enjoying those bushes, in part because of the work and because of the waiting. It's more exciting to hope I didn't kill them and see if I maybe get away with this and what they grow into. And there's different kinds of joy, but generally the greater the value over the greater amount of time makes for a greater treasure. Those bushes are not prettier than some of the other plants, but I put more work into them, and so I'm a little more excited about them. I say all that because we're going to be talking about some joy. And if those measures that I described make sense at all, if you can relate to what I'm describing, whether you like plants or not, but the idea of the labor and the waiting and how that increases joy. By that measure, my yard is a pebble of joy compared to the joy of being a witness for Christ. If you understand what brings joy and helps you treasure things, I'm hoping today that you get a picture of being a witness that isn't scary drudgery, but pure joy. So we're going to talk about faithfulness. And here's the big idea from the text. This is what I'm hoping you catch. It's this: God has given us everything we need and rewards us with more than we could ever want for a faithful witness to Christ. Share Him with joy. Yeah, we can. Oh, I had slides for the plants. There's my starter plants. And then I think I have a slide for my jungle. Let's see if it goes. There we go. That was supposed to be happening while I was talking. All right. So there's the line. I'm going to read through the passage, and you can follow along. When we talk about discipleship, just as a side note, when I teach discipleship from the Gospel of Matthew, one of the principles, observation number 11 on discipleship, that we hit on is seen majorly in this passage, and it's you can see up on the screen there. Success is measured by faithfulness, not results. That's going to be one of the points we hit on, and you'll see it in this message. We're going to look at the whole parable, though. So follow along. I'm going to read Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, the parable of the talents. For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded them, and he made 5 talents more. So also He who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. The master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, that had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more. The master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This parable and the one that comes after it that we'll look at probably next week are well-known parables. And they speak generally of a judgment, of a standing before Christ and giving an answer for the life that you've lived. I think, though, it's helpful to remember that this parable didn't just come out of nowhere. There's a broader context that this fits into, and it does tie into the topics we've been looking at. We've had this broader context in Matthew with Jesus having explicitly condemned the religious leadership in Jerusalem and cleansed the temple. I know it's been a while preaching-wise, but as far as timeline, we were in the temple just a little bit ago, and he was kicking people out of the temple just a little bit ago. We're only a hair removed from all this. His direct condemnation of these leaders and his message to his disciples pronouncing woes over them, that was just Matthew chapters 21 and 22. This all happened just as Jesus walks out of the temple. He gives those messages. As he walks out of the temple, the disciples look at the temple, and that's what started the conversation and the message that this parable is in the middle of. So, I mean, that's how close we are. I know when we preach on for several weeks, you can feel like, well, that was months ago. It was months ago for us. It was moments ago. Maybe a few days, some of it the same day, for Jesus and the disciples, for the message we're currently reading. So I say all that because I think that local context and the things we've been talking about in all of there helps ground the meaning of this parable. And we need that because I think, at least for me, this parable is often taken in a really generic way. We read it super generally. You know, these people have stuff that was entrusted to them, and they should have done something with it. Very well then, I have talents, I have abilities, or I have finances or influence or whatever. You can pick anything. Am I using those for Christ? And that's how we preach this parable. And there's nothing wrong with that message, fair enough. I mean, Jesus did say back in chapter 12, verse 36, that you're going to have to give an answer for every idle word you say. So I'm not going to say that you shouldn't care about pretty much everything in your life, because you should. But I think this parable has a particular thing, that the talent actually represents something more specifically that Jesus has in mind. Because we've got a motif here that should be really familiar. It should have jumped out when you think about where we've been. We have a servant that's been given a gift and didn't use it in the way that he should have, and so it's taken away and given to others. That's a storyline that's been repeated over and over, 6, 7, 8 times in the last 3 chapters. Jesus said the same thing repeatedly of the Jewish leaders for the past chapters. They've been given the law, and they've been given the temple. They've been given the covenant and this blessing. And that blessing of God's word was intended that through them, the whole world should be blessed. It's Genesis 12, 2 and 3. It's in their own Torah. They were meant to be a light to the Gentiles. It's Isaiah 49:6. I will make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach the end of the earth. That's not New Testament stuff. That was Israel's mission based on what they were given in the Old Testament. And Jesus has been rebuking them. They were given all that, and yet when Jesus arrives at the temple, the court of the Gentiles, that space that's meant to be for the nations, was filled with money changers, sellers of doves. They'd slammed the door on the nations. And this matters because they'd been entrusted with a mission to be a witness. You can hear that commission all through the Old Testament. Listen to these words clear back in Isaiah. Again, this is God's mission for his people. He says, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all those who mourn, to grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, a garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, plantings of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Do you hear this? We're in Isaiah, and he's saying, preach good news. Our word gospel means good news. The gospel was supposed to be being preached before Jesus got here. Jesus and his disciples are doing what Israel had not. That's the rebuke that we've been talking about since chapter 20. They had been given a gift, a precious gift. And the word here, when it says a talent, it's not talent as in an ability. It's a reference to a kind of money, and it's a large sum of money, probably several $1,000s in today's cash. There's different ways to take it, but the lower end is like $3,000 a talent, and there's ways that imply it could be more than that. So what was the treasure that the master expected to see an increase on? It's been over and over the precious promises, the message of a Messiah Savior and faith in him. That's not a new message. That's the message that was entrusted to Israel, the salvation they were supposed to preach to the nations. And so it was not just a message given to Israel, but a gospel they were supposed to bring to the poor, the captive, the brokenhearted, and to all who mourn. Israel was supposed to be like towering trees of righteousness that pointed people upwards to the glory of God. And instead, they hid that message. They pushed the Gentiles away, fill up the court, stay away from those people. They despised the poor. You remember when Jesus comes in, he cleanses the temple, and then he floods it with the blind and the lame and the children. And it's the temple leaders that start protesting. Make them be quiet. Make them stop worshiping Jesus. That happened just a few chapters ago. Matthew 21, verses 14 through 17. What we see in the context that's led up to this sermon and what he's been saying over and over in these messages is they took the gospel, they took the treasure of God dwelling with man by grace, and they buried it underground to return it with nothing else when Jesus entered that temple to shouts of Hosanna, O save us. He came in judgment on a temple and a Jewish leadership that had failed of their duty. And so when you come to that, that's who the wicked servant is in our parable. It's not a random reference to different guys. We've been talking about a servant who's been unfaithful, who had an expectation that he did not fulfill, and therefore is having what he had taken away from him and given to others. And so when you hear this parable in the context, it's not just generically about any old thing. He's still talking about the church in Israel and what God's about to do, and the warning for us in how we will be judged as well. So when this treasure is taken and given to others, that is the picture we've been looking at prophetically for the last chapter and a half. God will take away their temple. Instead, We see God pouring out His Holy Spirit on all those who believe and making their gatherings into holy temples. You have that all across the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 3:16 and 17, 6:19 and 20, 2 Corinthians 6:16, Ephesians 2:20 and 21. I mean, pick any of them. You see this picture. The talent has been taken from one and given to the other. The ones who are actually following the mission and honoring God. This is what we see happening, explicitly claimed in the New Testament epistles. The temple has gone global as the message that had been trapped and buried, as it were, in Jerusalem and in Israel begins to go to Judea and Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth. Acts 1:8. As Jesus said in chapter 24, His messengers are now finding the elect in the four corners of the earth. The treasure is now giving an increase. And so today's passage, when you see where we are in the context and you see who the servant is, today's passage is about faithfulness in sharing the good news that you have received. That's the treasure. And anyone who's put their faith in Jesus has received that treasure, and the treasure you have received, you're expected to do something with. You were not saved to idleness. You were rescued from the bondage of sin and placed into the mission of God so that all might hear. Yep, so that gets us to our first point. So what do we take from that? If we're going to read the parable that way, and it speaks to us in our witness. And the first thing I want you to know about witness, if it's a call to witness, they were responsible for what they had been given. I think this is great comfort. When you hear that you're called to a faithful witness, you're like, what do I got to say? What do I got to offer? All you're responsible for is what the Master gave you. This is not a mission done on your own strength. You don't have to come up with a fancy presentation. You don't have to be super talented. You simply need to share what God has given to you. If you've received forgiveness of sins by grace through faith, if you've found new life in Jesus, then that's what you need to share. That's your treasure. No more, no less. Maybe your version is short and sweet. One talent. Fine, go. Maybe you've been given more than that. You got lots of stories, come alongside and illustrate it. Great. What matters is just that you're taking what you received and you're sharing it with others. That's the increase that the Master expects. You know, I had you guys praying a week ago. Drama Ministry was doing their training camp. They're actually going to come out for Rossville Community Day this coming Saturday and do a presentation. And there's been some times when drama hits the stage where it's all clicking. And we have a presentation that just really, really hits. Where people are moved and they're just choked up with emotion. And in some of those situations, I'll have someone, afterwards compliment us and compliment what good artists we are for what we've put together. And I'm thankful for that. But there's a sense in which, and I've often replied this way to them, our art is a lot easier than other artists. We don't have to come up with a deep and moving message. We already have the deep and moving message. All we really do is figure out, we've been given the message of the death and resurrection of Jesus that brings forgiveness of sin and new life. Like that's already on the all we're doing is figuring out how to arrange it on a stage. My point is just that you don't need to figure out how to be the next Billy Graham and how to have this amazing pitch and fancy slogan or charts and banners. You just need to be a sinner who has been saved by grace. All you're doing is figuring out how to talk about that on whatever stage God gave you. There was a drama logo there. Boom. So, if you're just responsible for what you received, what I want to encourage you is you need to know and be able to share that treasure. If you had to tell me why Jesus matters to you, or how He is your Savior, what would you say? I mean, if right now I just went, you, go. Because that happens. We were handing out water bottles on the rail trail. I was at last year or the year before, and a lady came and took a water bottle, and she looked at those of us handing out, and she goes, she saw we were a Christian group. She goes, "Great, what's your testimony?" And she just walked through all of us and put all of them on the spot. "What's your testimony? Go." So, are you ready? If that happens, you're going to be like, have another water bottle? How would you do if you were put in a spot like that? Because look, I don't care if your version is 2 sentences long or 5 chapters long. What matters is that you can tell someone that putting your faith in Jesus is good news and has forgiven your sins and brought you into new life. Adorn it with whatever details from your story you want to illustrate it, however many or however few. But you need to be able to tell them that much. Are you ready to do that? Maybe the takeaway you need from this parable is today to go home and sit down with a notebook and write it out. Figure out how to say it. You need to be able to share the treasure that you've received. My version is pretty short. I came to Christ super young. So I don't have a long story of all the evils that I did prior to meeting Jesus. 5-year-old Tim was not a chain smoker, drug dealer, womanizer, maybe a little bit of a womanizer. But you get my drift. It doesn't matter. What I know is this. One night, laying in my bed, I became convicted and aware that I did not have a relationship with God. I knew that I was a sinner, and that my sin is what stood between me and God. That much 5-year-old Tim understood. I knew from the messages I had heard in church since my earliest memories that Jesus died so that anyone who put their faith in him could be forgiven. So there in my bed, I prayed something like, "Jesus, I don't know how to do this right, but I want my sins forgiven and I want to live with you." And I entered into new life that night. God became a part of my life from that day forward. I began to be convicted over how I lived, and I began to pray on my own more and more. There were ups and downs from there, but he's always been with me, and he's always been good. That's the treasure I found, and it's the treasure I'd be thrilled for you to have too. Now I dare you to have a simpler version. You think your story is so short, that's mine. I bet yours is cooler. Are you just ready to share it? You're responsible to share just what you've been given. And the second thing, and it's the one I said we talk about in discipleship, I think this is a really important thing for us individually, but also for us as a church to catch, which is that success is measured by faithfulness, not results. This master has a weird accounting method because he's not concerned with results, he's concerned with faithfulness. You see that because the 2 servants who are praised in our passage, they have different amounts. We hear this in verses 19 and 23. But note that they get the exact same praise. It's basically word-for-word repetition. They had different amounts of money entrusted to them. They brought back different amounts in return. And none of that mattered. It's not how much that matters. It's just that they obeyed. And you might say, well, they did the same percent. They both doubled their investment. But listen to this. Even his rebuke of the wicked servant implies it wasn't, oh, you have to double it. It was, you should have done anything. Because he says, you knew, and so you should have taken it and just put it in the bank and got me some interest. That's not going to double the 1 talent to 2. The amount doesn't matter. What the master cared about was faithfulness. I gave you a job. Did you do it? Did you try to do it? Because if you went out and obeyed me, whatever you brought back is fine. And the words he uses in praising those servants is, well done, good and faithful servant. It's the faithfulness that he praises. Even a small interest would have been enough. The point isn't how much, it's do something, do anything. The master doesn't need a return. He's looking for faithful servants. You were given a job. Did you do it? Results may vary based on how much you were given, how much opportunities you found. He doesn't judge whether you pick the best or the worst opportunities. He doesn't critique on how much or how little. It's simply a matter of, did you obey at all? That's the problem with the wicked servant. And that's why the other two are treated identically. So if we're going to assess ourselves in light of this passage, the question isn't how many people did I lead to Christ? When I do an outreach, our question shouldn't be how many people do we get to show up, or how many people do we get to come and visit our church afterwards. Those are all judging by results, but that's usually what we default to. We count everything. And I'm not against us counting it, but you just need to be careful that you don't confuse those numbers with success. Because here's the problem. When you make the numbers and the results the judgment, you can manipulate numbers if you don't have to be faithful. I bet we've got an outreach coming up. St. Paul's going to do a meal in the parking lot in October. So we're advertising it. We hope some people will come. We're going to try and share the gospel with them. And yeah, we would love it if some people we meet in the parking lot would come out and join our church. But just sharing the gospel with them, I mean, maybe some will come and maybe some will come to church. But I'll bet you if instead we advertise in the paper that anyone who comes to our parking lot that day gets $20, our numbers would be a lot higher. And if we did a follow-up that if you visit the church, you get another $20. I mean, we could be turning reports to the denomination with best numbers for local outreaches, percentage by church. I mean, we could knock it out of the park. I mean, if it's okay to just bribe them, literally just pay them to give us results. Maybe we spiritualize a little bit. Okay, don't give them a straight $20. Instead, we'll just promise them that if they come, God will bless them and give them financial breakthroughs and healings. I mean, if we can just put words in God's mouth and still bribe people, and it doesn't matter whether it's true, you can get numbers. That's a tried and true trick that has been done. And we look at that and we say, wow, look at the success because the numbers, because the results. If you critique the guys who play that way, you're like, oh, you're just jealous of their numbers. Numbers are not success. That's not how it's measured in the kingdom. We are accountable for our faithfulness. That formula works for many. But if we bribe and lie our way into numbers, is that going to stand before the judgment of Christ? According to this passage, no. No. We need to judge by faithfulness, not numbers. If we share the gospel with conviction and clarity and nobody wants to hear it, so be it. I can face Christ and say, I shared what you gave me. Besides that, we have such a limited perspective. To judge by results is silly because we can't see all the results. We got this narrow little vision of what we can see and touch to measure by. I don't know the final results. I just know the little bit that we could see, the little bit that showed up in my church. You don't know that when you witness to someone that they might show up at somebody else's church next Sunday. Is that a lose because they didn't show up where you could count them? If they're not in our building, does it not matter? I have a little booklet in my office, and it was made as the evangelical churches in Northeast India were celebrating 100 years of the gospel in Northeast India. It's kind of cool because Pastor Ken, who preached at St. Paul before me, is actually in the booklet because he went there to celebrate with them. He helped teach in one of their seminaries. They're celebrating 100 gospel to Northeast India. There was a fellow that felt burdened to see the gospel there. He found 2 translators and went on a mission trip through the mountains and got up into Northeast India, traveled around, did a whole bunch of gospel preaching and revival services, and converted nobody except his 2 translators because they heard the message over and over. So he led them to Christ, came home with no fruit from any of the places he visited, thought it was a failure, but those 2 translators went back and began preaching. And gospel seeds began to take root in Northeast India. I looked up numbers. If you go and look at a 2011 survey of India, about 2.3% of India population is Christian. But if you just narrow it down to Northeast India, it's about 75% of the population of Northeast India is Christian. That's insane, because if you're going 2.3% of India population is Christian, you know where most of those people are then, if 75% of Northeast India. Like, that's where most of the Christians are. Weird ways. You don't always get to see the whole story. I think he did actually get to go back and do some follow-up and see some of the blessing. But when you judge by results, you're judging by something you can't even see and isn't even in your hands. Was faithful, and that's all that matters. God took it from there. So as you assess the challenge, I mean, this is a parable that calls you to witness. Make sure you measure that by the right standard. This is something we try to do here at Christ House. That's why I don't ask you how many people did you get to pray with and lead to Jesus this week. And if none of you got to pray with somebody, we don't light the candle. We light a candle if you witnessed, because if you're being a faithful witness, that's what God asked you to do, and the results are up to Him. Measure by the standard of faithfulness. And I think this is super important, because when it comes to witnessing, we are quick to make excuses. And depending what you measure by, sometimes the bad measurement allows you to make some bad excuses. For one, if you don't measure by faithfulness, just by results, some of us already have a bunch of results. Right? If you're like me and you've got a long chunk of Christian road already behind you, you can lean on your past obedience as an excuse for doing nothing today. Right? Sure, I'm faithful. Look at all the things I've done. Look at all the people I witnessed to 15 years ago. Or back when I was in high school, or that one time when I was super excited, or right after I got saved. You can have a burst of obedience, and if you just measure by results, you're like, I got something in the bag, so I'm good. I can coast till the master gets back. And that's great and all. I'm glad you did those things. But does living for Jesus mean anything to you last week? This month? When was the last time you prayed over a lost neighbor or spoke up for Christ? The answer has got years ago taxed to it. I don't know if that's faithfulness. You're dodging a faithfulness measure, hiding behind a results answer. But maybe you're on the other side. You just go all negative, right? Your excuses are just, I'm shy, I don't know that many people, I don't go anywhere, I'm a homebody. I mean, how am I going to witness to anybody? Cool. But again, results was not the answer we're looking for. Unless you live on a desert island, you are around some people who need to know Jesus, and you have what they need. I mean, it's just being faithful with what you got. So what do you got? Could you share? Could you carry a gospel tract with you to the grocery store? Please hand it out in the checkout line. Could you choose to pay inside instead of at the pump at the gas station, so you meet one more person every week? Could you offer to pray for your waitress when you eat out? I mean, you don't have to do much to have opportunities. You have opportunities, and it doesn't matter if it's a lot. Maybe you're absolutely right. It's just a couple. Cool. Be faithful with that couple. You have the gospel, and you have people. Be faithful. Measuring by faithfulness isn't about whether anyone you talk to responds. It's just praying each week. God, are there opportunities that you've given me that I'm missing? Please help me to see them and to take them. If you prayed that every week, you would find that you have way more opportunities than you think you do. We walk by so many. I just hope to hear, well done, my good and faithful servant. Last point. The reward is the joy of the master. You hear this. We got two good servants. The master praises and rewards the two good servants with the same reward. Again, not more reward for the one that brought more stuff. One reward, same reward. They are praised for their faithfulness, and they're rewarded with relational joy. It says that in verses 21, 23. Enter into the joy of your master. I love it. This is why I opened with all that plant nonsense. See, I bet some of you are really uncomfortable with what I've preached so far. Witnessing is scary stuff. You would have rathered that we just talk about this parable in super general hobbies, maybe all of them, if you just don't have to witness. anything, just not witnessing, because it's scary. We think of it as this tough thing, fraught with hard questions, anxiety, and rejection. I mean, it's like we imagine that if we actually shared our faith regularly, it would be the most miserable life possible. Like, what worse could happen to me? But the faithful witness isn't miserable. That's not what they get for being faithful in witness. They get maximal joy. What do I mean? I'm borrowing heavily from C.S. Lewis here, but joy always is tied to an object, and the better the object, the greater the joy. You don't just joy random, you joy about something or over something, right? If you saw a movie that you really liked, some of you have done this here in this building with me. You take joy in telling everyone how they need to see it, and you struggle not to spoil it by telling us all the cool parts that you're so excited about. What you like most, you're enjoying it. Now, if the movie was not amazing, you can still tell your friends about it and invite them to go see it, but there will be less enthusiasm, less excitement, less joy, right? It has to be a good movie to get you all wound up like that. The quality of the object affects the degree of the joy. And so all I'm talking about is the joy of movies, if you will. You can only squeeze so much joy out of a subpar film. And likewise, you can only get some joy from temporary things, short-term solutions and shortcuts in parenting and work and marriage, etc. For a hot minute, that can seem pleasant. You take the shortcut, and it's kind of fun. Till it's not. It's limited. It's a small joy or a fading joy. You can only wring so much joy out of that because in reality, it's just not that great. Quality and the duration matter for the joy. So when you touch on bigger things, there is greater joy. I take joy in the long road of trying to parent my daughter well. I say trying because I can only shoot for faithfulness here. I don't know what the results are going to be. But there's a joy. There's more joy in discipline and training so that she might flourish over time. And when I see bits of growth and maturity in her, that's way cooler than when I give her ice cream. Giving her ice cream's fun for a second. And then there's the sugar high, and then there's the begging for it 24/7 for the next day. It can only get so much joy out of that. But when I see her wanting to participate with what we're doing here at church, it's still a parenting joy, but it's a whole nother level of parenting joy. There's more joy in that than appeasing her for a mere moment. And so if you're with me so far, if you understand what I'm getting, we're saying value, meaning, and breadth of a thing all expand our joy in and from it. If that's true, and I think it is, then there is no greater joy than the joy of the Master. We've talked about the joys of parenting. We've talked about the joys of movies. Take the logic over. If the object of the joy is the Master, then there's no greater joy. When I touch on a joy that is rooted in the eternal, maximally good, maximally worthy God, there is nothing that can compare to that joy. Now hear me. That's the joy you taste in faithful witness. Think of all those fears and anxieties you felt earlier about witnessing. Can I tell you, they are joy-stealing lies? That's the lies you believe that keep you from tasting the best joy ever. If you've ever gotten to share the gospel with someone and they even listened a little bit, it's a joy. It's a crazy big joy. There have been times where I'm with some friends and we're going, so we weren't out trying to witness or anything, but a chance witnessing opportunity came up. Somebody ran into us, and we got to share with them about Christ. And when they walk off, there's these big grins on our faces that we just can't stop smiling like idiots. Why? Because it was just so cool that it happened. And we got to share, and we took it, and we're floating for the rest a little bit. Friends, I know I hit on witnessing a lot from this pulpit. And I'll blame the text. I just preach the passages I'm given, and we're in Matthew forever. Fine. But when Jesus laments over the failure of Israel to be a light to be the light they were called to be. He's lamenting that they missed out on the joy of the Master. You've got a group that's got the law and the prophets and the temple and no joy. You see all the legalism, all the judgment, all the infighting. That's what you get when you lose the joy. There is a life, a radiant joy that is available to our church. There is a fire already to be unleashed. And it's not based on numbers. It doesn't matter how many people are in this room. It's not reflected in last week's offering or attendance. It's the joy of the Master as the reward of faithful witness. And I wish you joy. I call you to witness because I wish you joy. Don't settle for cheap joys. For our church, and for your personal life before the Lord. Enjoying God is the reward and fuel for witness. So part of how we stir our hearts to witness is to train them to love the deeper joys, to not settle for the little things. If you live your life settling for cheap joys, playing about with gluttony and greed, jealousy and pride, you're choking out the appetite for eternity. Enjoy God now, and you'll be a whole lot more excited about enjoying Him in your witnessing. Worship fuels witness. We do it for the joy set before us. There's a joy compelling us and a joy sought. And that's why witness is not scary, dreadful. It's not a punishment. It's a gift. Psalm 37:4. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. If you enjoy God now, your heart will desire that joy. If you'll desire the reward of witness, when you delight in Him, and then you hear, enter into the joy of your Master, you go, yes, that's what I want. Every movement of God in mobilizing His people to a vibrant witness, you look across history, began in the private devotions of those same saints. It began with Christians huddled in prayer, praising and adoring their God. Revival in the hearts of an individual person in devotion and awe and wonder before the Lord. That preceded vibrant witness because they tasted a joy that drove them into witness where they found that joy completed. It's in the hidden place of daily prayer and praise that you can taste what is promised here and will begin to long for its fullness. So if I'm going to call you to witness, what I have to call you to first is commit yourself to a life of worship. And witness will grow from that fertile soil. You do it for the joy. This week, how and when will you delight in the Lord? Because if you're not even training yourself to want that joy, this whole parable made no sense. A bunch of guys did stuff you don't want to do to get a prize you don't want to get. The daily duty of delight is what nurtures a vibrant witnessing church. Faithfulness. God has given us everything we need and rewards us with more than we could ever want for a faithful witness to Christ. Share Him with joy. So here's the questions for you to discuss. We'll let you guys break into a group or two. 1, how can, or do, I'm fine if you share stuff you're currently doing, how can you or how do you worship God at home in your private spiritual practices? I don't know if you're like me. When I think devotions, because I'm kind of a study teacher personality, it's all study. My devotions is read and research. And someone says, well, and how do you delight in them? I'm like, I wasn't delighting. I was just busy diagramming. And there's goodness in that. And I think there is even some devotion, some joy in that. But there's a reminder that God needs to not just be my study topic, He needs to be my joy. So how do you practice that, or how could you be practicing it? 2, what opportunities for witness do you have? And what would faithfulness look like in those situations? Let's start opening our eyes to see the opportunities that are already here that each of us has.